الله بالخير. الهاسبارا مستند ومشروع ومجهود دعائي يستثمر فيه كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ملايين الدولارات لتأليب الناس وإقناعهم بالسردية الصهيونية والتأثير في الرأي العام والسياسة. هو ألف باء تبرير أعمال إسرائيل العدائية تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني وتسويقها ودعمها بحجة ما يسمى الدفاع عن النفس. ميكو بيليد الكاتب والناشط الأمريكي الذي ولد في فلسطين المحتلة لعائلة صهيونية مهاجرة من مؤسسي كيان الاحتلال، دحض ويدحض سردية الاحتلال الكاذبة والزائفة، ودعا ويدعو إلى مقاطعة إسرائيل وفرض العقوبات عليها وسحب الاستثمارات منها. إسرائيل تدعي أنها الديمقراطية الوحيدة في الشرق الأوسط، فلماذا تعتقل المدافعين عن حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني؟ كيف تعمل الهاسبارا على قلب الحقائق لترميم صورة كيان الاستيطان العنصري وسياساته المقيتة وتلميعها؟ هل خسرت إسرائيل معركة الرأي العام في الغرب؟ بدأ الكيان بالتحلل من الداخل، فمتى يكون السقوط المدوي؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا ميكو بيليد الكاتب والناشط في مجال حقوق الإنسان الذي ينضم إلينا من واشنطن في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. ميكو بيليد, American author and human rights defender, vocal supporter of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions (BDS), who advocates the creation of one democratic state with equal rights in all of historic Palestine. Beylied has been arrested several times by the Israeli authorities for his activism in support of the Palestinians. Miko Beylied, salam and welcome to Al-Miadin. This is the proximate aspect, and I'm Zainab Al-Safar. So good to have you, Miko.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Huge pleasure to have you. Well, Hasbara Handbook promoting Israel on campus is a reference that divulges how Israel's mindset operates. To combat BDS, the Israeli cabinet approved in 2022 a project that could inject up to $30 million toward covertly funding government propaganda in the US and other Western countries. The project, Miko, which was initially established under the name Solomon's Sling and relaunched in 2022 as Concert, was rebranded today in 2023 and is now operating under a new name, quote-unquote, Voices of Israel. The plan is to transfer money indirectly to foreign organizations that will spread Israeli propaganda in the countries in which they operate, all while hiding the fact that they are backed by the Israeli government. My question, Miko, did Israel lose the war for public opinion abroad to relaunch and rebrand a heavily funded plan to disguise its own propaganda behind the facade of foreign agents?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you again for having me. I think as long as we can make the apartheid regime pay, as long as we can make the apartheid regime costly for Israelis, then we are winning, of course. And so the more money they spend on spewing their lies, the more money they spend on all these agencies in the West trying to tell their lies and spew their lies, the better it is for us, because this is money that they're not spending hopefully on weapons. But there's no question that Israel is on the defensive. The apartheid regime is now cornered, with Amnesty International coming out and declaring very clearly that it's an apartheid regime, that it is committing crimes against humanity. All they can do now is hope that the truth remains hidden. And it's very difficult to hide the truth when you're talking about Palestine, a place which is the highest profile places in the world.
Hasbara is a public diplomacy technique, Miko, which links information warfare with the strategic objectives of Israel. How does Hasbara turn the facts around to restore and polish the image of this racist settlement entity and its policies?
Well, the king of Hasbara is, of course, the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and he just wrote a book. And since he was reelected, he has been on every news show, on every interview here, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe as well, claiming these complete rewritten history about Palestine and about the and the role of Zionism within Palestine, a complete fabrication of the facts. And the problem is that the journalists, the politicians in the West are afraid to challenge him. He never once was challenged about the facts, which are not facts, which are complete fabrications, in his book and in the claims that he makes in the interviews. And that's the problem. So we see a very big gap. We see the reality where public opinion is clearly turning more and more to become, pro-justice. It's not just pro-Palestine, but it's really pro-justice and pro-truth. And then you have the level of the politicians and the corporate media that are unwilling to listen to the public opinion, because at this point they don't need to. And they are allowing the continued support and the continued admiration of Benjamin Netanyahu and the entire apartheid enterprise.
Right. In talking about challenging the abhorrent narrative of the current prime minister and those before him, let's talk a bit about yourself, Miko. You were born in Al-Quds in 1961 and grew up in a prominent Zionist family. Your grandfather, Avram Katz-Nelson, signed the so-called Israel's Declaration of Independence. Your father, Matityahu Peled, fought in the 1948 Israeli-Arab War and served as a general in the Six-Day War of 1967. Miko, though you followed your father's footsteps at first, joining Israel's Special Forces after high school, yet soon enough you surrendered your status, disgusted by the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and you buried your service pin in the dirt, as you say. Why? What happened precisely?
The education that I received and that many young Israelis receive is based on fabrication. It's based on lies. It's based on this myth that the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine was some kind of a war of independence, that it was somehow heroic. And from there, everything that follows is that the Arabs are wrong and bad, and what the Zionists did is, of course, good and heroic. Once you realize that that is all based on a lie, then, at least in my case, you have to make a choice. Where does your conscience lead you? Does your conscience lead you to continue to perpetuate the lies and perpetuate the crimes that the Zionists have been committing in Palestine? Or do you come out and reject it? And in my case, I chose to reject it, and reject it publicly, because with the background I have that you described, I think people listen. I mean, there's a little more of a voice when you come from the background that I have. And so I use that in order to tell the truth about Palestine.
Right. You were raised, Miko, in the most Zionist environment one could possibly have. You once said, quote, "I know Zionism from within. Its expression is violence." How do you define Zionism? what is the real story of Zionists in Palestine, the story and narrative that Western mainstream media deliberately tries to hide?
Well, it's quite simple, really. It's a racist, violent ideology that produced a racist, violent political entity, which is the so-called State of Israel, the apartheid State of Israel. So it's very, very simple if we want to keep it short. The entire ideology behind the State of Israel, the entire Zionist ideology, is a racist, violent ideology. It's Eurocentric, which means that people who are not European don't count, and they can be killed and their land can be taken and so forth. And that's precisely what's been happening. I think what we see today in the Western world, in the Western governments, from the US president all the way to prime ministers throughout Europe and so forth, where they have no shame in standing up and saying, I'm a Zionist and we support Zionism. Whereas the EU commissioner recently said that Israel is some kind of a miracle and a wonderful thing. These people are associating themselves with the worst kind of racism, with the worst kind of brutality, and their constituents must let them know. Their constituents must stand up and demand an end to this willingness to be associated with brutality and violence and racism. This is precisely what needs to end.
Sure. Now, the Islamic Christian Committee in support of Al-Quds and its sanctuaries recently warned that the Israeli occupation is planning to turn the Bab al-Rahma prayer hall, which is part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, into a Jewish synagogue. And that's why it has been pounded recently, time and again. In its statement, the committee warned of a pre-planned Israeli maneuver to Judaize Al-Aqsa Mosque. What is the real story of what is happening in Al-Aqsa today and the desecration by Israeli extreme settlers time and again, as we said, of this Muslim holy site? Why? And what is the story within? And what about the so-called Temple Mount groups?
Well, this requires a little bit of background, because the desire to build a temple to replace a so-called temple, I should say, to replace Al-Aqsa is part of the Israeli national identity. This has been part of Israeli identity going back, decades. I remember as a child singing songs, and I was raised completely secular, singing songs about the building of the temple. One day we shall rebuild the temple. And I grew up in a secular school in a secular society, a Zionist, of course. And so this has been going on for a very long time. And of course, the 1967 assault, Israel's assault against its neighbors, what's known as the Six-Day War, this was one of the key issues. And there's even, if you ask people, Israelis, what do they remember from the 1967 war? There's the sentence that was uttered by the commander of the forces who took Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, where he said, Har Bayit B'Yadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. What does he care about the Temple Mount? He was not a religious man, but it is a national symbol. And the temple, like you said, the Temple Mount loyalists and all of these groups, many of whom are now part of the Netanyahu coalition, have been pushing to see this materialize, and they're very successful. And there's no question that the plan is not only to take Bab al-Rahma, I think that would be the first step, but the process that we saw in El Khalil, in the Ibrahimi Mosque, in the Masjid Ibrahimi in El Khalil, where gradually more and more and more of the mosque is taken by settlers, we are going to see the same thing. It's called the Hebronization of Al-Aqsa. And we're going to see the exact same thing happening, where more and more is taken from Palestinians and from the rights of Muslims to pray in Al-Aqsa. Complete disregard for the history, for the heritage, for the religious significance of the place, and to create more and more of kind of a Zionist, I don't want to say Jewish, but a Zionist entity, kind of a semi-religious place for the Zionist settlers to pray. It's a terrible process, and unless the world intervenes very forcefully, this process will not stop until it's catastrophic.
When you say it like that, Miko, you are going to be accused, of course, and you have been accused by the Israelis of anti-Semitism for exposing Israel and Zionism. Tina Marinari from Amnesty International and Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, are also being accused of anti-Semitism, and dozens of others who defend the Palestinian rights. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not equivalent. Do you agree? Neither are they two sides of the same coin. Why every critic of the Israeli policies who highlights Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights and the illegal occupation of Palestinian land is branded and stigmatized as anti-Semitic?
Well, the Hasbara organizations realized that the term anti-Semitic is very powerful. And so they created a whole campaign of weaponizing this term, weaponizing anti-Semitism. And so you're right. I mean, anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and Zionism is a form of racism. So fighting Zionism and fighting anti-Semitism is the same thing. Both people, if you oppose Zionism and you oppose anti-Semitism and you oppose all forms of racism, that is clearly the right stance. Supporting Zionism is supporting racism. It's as simple as that. But they are always in this process of finding new tools to justify what they do and to attack the people who are telling the truth about Palestine. So, so we are all called anti-Semitic and we are called all kinds of names. I think it's a small sacrifice to pay in order to tell the truth and stand with our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Right. Now, Palestinian detainee and martyr Sheikh Khadr Adnan, who became an icon of Palestinian resistance to Israeli detention policies, died while in detention recently after an 87-day hunger strike. The European Union called on Israeli authorities to investigate his death. Of course, that's nonsense of calls. And as usual, how pathetic just to call for that. How do you view, what's your sense of such horrendous acts by Israel and their message?
Well, I don't think there's any question. The Sheikh Khadr Adnan, Allah yarhamoh, was a hero. He was a courageous. I don't think there's a more courageous act that one can take upon himself than a hunger strike, and he's done this 4 times, I believe. And there's nothing to investigate. He was on the verge of death, and they threw him in the cell and let him die. There's no other way to describe it but murder. In fact, it's a double crime because the first crime was arresting him in the first place under the what Israel calls administrative detention, where they detain people without charge, and that's precisely what he was protesting. And other Palestinian prisoners were protesting as well through hunger strikes. But this is the first time that Israel actually murdered one, allowed one to go all the way to the death, and that's because in this particular government, the minister who's in charge of the prisons and in charge of this sort of thing, he wants to see Palestinians die, and he doesn't care. But this is a watershed moment. The world needs to see this as a watershed moment. A great, courageous fighter was murdered in the worst possible way, trying to stand up. And he wasn't standing up for anything huge. He was standing up for the principle of stopping the administrative detention, stopping the detention of Palestinians without charging them.
Sure.
He wasn't asking for the world. He was asking for justice. And for that, he was killed. And of course, he's going to be remembered, for future generations as a great hero. But this is an example of just how severe the situation is, and that it's going to become more and more severe unless the international community, the Arab world, the Muslim world, and so on, stand up firmly and start demanding sanctions, severe sanctions, and boycotting the state of Israel and Israeli institutions and Israeli teams.
True. The Pentagon leaks revealed that the Mossad encouraged its staff and the general public to take part in the massive protest. And has Israel become a burden to the United States?
It's a burden, but it's not quite as, I think, burdensome enough.
Mm-hmm.
But these many thousands of Israelis are protesting because they worry that their own rights as privileged people within the apartheid regime are somehow in danger. And these hundreds of thousands of Israelis never stood up when Israel was bombing Lebanon. They never stood up when Israel bombs Gaza. They never stand up when Israel is bombing in Syria. They only stand up when it has to do with some kind of a risk to their own privilege.
Right. Could and would those new challenges from within constitute the solid justification, Miko, for dismantling the entity? As Israeli media reported, are we witnessing the beginning of the collapse of Israel from within?
Well, Israel has never been a cohesive society. It's been a society full of different
fractures
types of groups
and poles,
factions that are at odds with each other all the time. What we're seeing now, yes, now what we're seeing now is the beginning of the expression of how this is being torn apart. And I know Netanyahu and his government are probably going to try to throw them something to appease them. Nobody knows how it's going to end. But what is very clear is now we are seeing these tensions between the different factions within Israeli society. And of course, anybody who cares for justice wants to see this the dismantlement of the apartheid state and to see it replaced with a real free democratic Palestine.
Right. Also today, a succession of events that started in Barcelona in Spain last February before moving to major cities in Belgium and Norway in April has sent a strong message to Israel. The Palestinian boycott, divestment and sanctions BDS movement is alive, well and kicking. Why are major European cities today rejecting Israeli appetite, Miko?
You know, this is the process. The process is that step by step, city by city, province by province, eventually country by country, Israel is going to be sanctioned, and Israeli groups, anybody who represents Israel will feel what it's like to be on the other side of a boycott. I think it's high time for that. I mean, I wish this happened, 10, 20 years ago, but of course it's better late than never. But like you said, the process of solidarity with Palestinians, the process of understanding where the world stands in relation to Palestine, in relation to Palestinians, is becoming more and more clear. And as we see politicians who are more aware on the local level, like you said, on the city level and on a county level, then we are going to see more and more of this. I don't think there's any question. And it was very similar to what happened with South Africa, apartheid in South Africa, where it began small until eventually entire states began to sanction and impose boycotts. But today, I think it's very difficult. One of the worst jobs in the world is to be a diplomat representing Israel. I can't imagine a more despicable job, and a job where you are hated more than to be an Israeli diplomat.
Right. Is Israel finding it harder to push its racism and propaganda, and consequently its Hasbara in the US today?
Yes and no. And so we have this is still an ongoing struggle between, like you said, the solidarity around the world for Palestinians and the politicians, and even everyday citizens who do not understand why boycotting or sanctioning Israel is necessary. So we still have a lot of work in front of us to explain and to demonstrate why we are calling to boycott, why we are calling to sanction, why Israel is a criminal entity that needs to be shunned and treated like a pariah.
Right. What's your message today to the Palestinians, Miko?
Well, my inspiration comes from Palestinians, from my Palestinian brothers and sisters who are out there fighting every single day, existing every single day, everywhere from the Naqab in the south to Al Jalil in the north, from Lid, Ramle, and Yafa on the coast, all the way to the people who reside on the Jordan River Valley by the Jordan River. Palestinians are fighting every single day, and yet at the same time, they send their kids to school. They dream of a future. They plan a future. They work as hard as they can. And so Palestinians are doing everything they possibly can, and they inspire me, and I would hope they would inspire others to stand up and support the cause for a free Palestine and justice for Palestinians.
Thank you very much, Miko, for being such a genuine, lively voice for Palestine. Amazing talking to you, Mr. Beylied.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you. لعل مشهد طرد السفيرة الإسرائيلية شارون بارلي مع زملائها من حفل افتتاح قمة الاتحاد الأفريقي في أديس أبابا في أثيوبيا في شباط فبراير المنصرم بات مشهدا تاريخيا، إذ تحولت تلك اللحظة بالذات التي كانت لتتويج 20 عاما من الدبلوماسية الإسرائيلية في القارة الأفريقية في بضع ثوان إلى رمز لفشل وجود الكيان الإسرائيلي في أفريقيا، حيث أوضحت الدول الأفريقية أن قرار تعليق عضوية إسرائيل هي مسألة مبدأ. لعله الموقف المبدئي نفسه لميكو بيليد الذي يؤمن كما كثيرون بأن هذا الجيل بأكمله سيحكم علينا من خلال موقفنا من فلسطين، وأننا جميعا نريد أن نكون في مكان عندما يسألنا فيه أطفالنا وأحفادنا أين وقفنا من هذه القضية، يمكننا الرد بأننا وقفنا في صف العدالة. ولعل بيليد يفهم ويقدر التجربة الفلسطينية، وهذا أمر نابع من تجربة حقيقية للواقع الفلسطيني ولفلسطين نفسها كدولة وكأمة وكثقافة. ولكن لماذا لا يزال البعض القريب منهم والبعيد معمياً عن هذه الحقيقة الراسخة؟ من كل الميادين سلاماً وتحية، في مان الله.